I wanted to read another story of a slightly different kind, which is about writing and where writing comes from. And I don't think I need to say any more than that. The little story is quite short. It's called A Medium, and it is about a woman who is a medium. But the medium is also writing itself. When I was 11, I took violin lessons once a week from a Miss Katie McIntyre, always so called to distinguish her from Miss Pearl, her sister, who taught piano and accompanied us at exams. Miss Katie had a big sunny studio in a building in the city, which was occupied below by dentists, paper suppliers, and cheap photographers. It was on the 4th floor and was approached by an old-fashioned cage lift that swayed precariously as it rose beyond the smell of chemical fluid and an occasional whiff of gas to the purer atmosphere Miss Katie shared with the only other occupant of the higher reaches, Miss E. Sampson, spiritualist. I knew about Miss Simpson from gossip I had heard among my mother's friends, and sometimes if I was early, I would find myself riding up with her, the two of us standing firm on our feet while the dark cage wobbled. The daughter of a well-known doctor, an anaesthetist, she had gone to Clayfield College, been clever, popular, a good sport. But then her gift appeared. That is how my mother's friends put it, just declared itself out of the blue, without in any way changing her cleverness or good humour. She tried at first to deny it. She went to the university and studied Greek. But it had its own end in view and would not be trifled with. It laid its hand on her, made its claim, set my mother's friends to wondering, not about Emily Sampson, but about themselves. They began to avoid her, and then, later, years later, to seek her out. Her contact, it seemed, was an Indian, whose male voice croaked from the delicate throat above the fichu of coffee-dipped lace. She sometimes spoke as well with the voices of the dead, little girls who had succumbed to diphtheria or blood poisoning, or been strangled in suburban parks, soldiers killed in one of the wars, drowned sailors, lost sons and brothers, husbands felled beside their dahlias at the bottom of the yard. Hugging my violin case, I pushed hard against the bars to make room for the presences she might have brought in with her. She was by then a woman of 49 or 50, small, straight, businesslike, in a tailored suit, with her hair cut in a silver helmet. She sucked Bonington's Irish moss for her voice, I could smell them, and advertised in the Courier Mail under services, along with chiropractor and colonic irrigation. It was odd to see her name listed so boldly, E. Sampson, spiritualist, in the foyer beside the lifts, among the dentists with their letters and the registered firms, PTY, LTD, and my own Miss McIntyre, LTCLAMEB. Miss Sampson's profession, so nakedly asserted, appeared to speak for itself with no qualification. She was herself the proof. It was this, I think, that put me in awe of her. It seemed appropriate in those days that music should be separated from the more mundane business that was being carried on below, the whizzing of dentist's drills, the plugging of cavities with amalgam or gold, and the making of passport photos for people going overseas. But I thought of Miss Sampson, for all her sensible shoes, as a kind of quack, and was sorry that Miss Katie and the arts should be associated with her, and with the troops of subdued, sad-eyed women, they were mostly women, who made the pilgrimage to her room and shared the last stages of the lift with us. Women whose husbands might have been bank managers, wearing smart hats and gloves and tilting their chins a little in defiance of their having at last come to it. Other women in dumpy floral, with freckled arms and too much talc, who worked in hospital kitchens or cleaned offices or took in washing, all decently gloved and hatted now, but looking scared of the company they were in and the heights to which the lift wobbled. The various groups hung apart, using their elbows, in a ladylike way, but using them, and producing genteel formulas such as pardon or I'm so sorry when the crush brought them close. Though touched already by a hush of spared anticipation, they had not yet accepted their commonality. There were distinctions to be observed even here. On such occasions, the lift, loaded to capacity, made heavy work of it. And it wasn't, I thought, simply the weight of bodies, 8 persons only, a notice warned, that made the old mechanism grind in its shaft, but the weight of all that sorrow, all that hopelessness and last hope, all that dignity in the privacy of grief, and silence broken only by an occasional, "Now don't you upset yourself, pet," or a whispered, "George would want it, I know he would." We ascended slowly. I found it preferable, on the whole, to arrive early and ride up fast and in silence with Miss Sampson herself. Sometimes, in a way of idle curiosity, if such motive could be ascribed to her, she would let her eyes for a moment rest on me, and I wondered hotly what she might be seeing beyond a plump 11-year-old with scarred knees clinging to Mozart. Like most boys of that age, I had much to conceal. But she appeared to be looking at me, not through me. She smiled, I responded, and clearing my throat to find a voice, would say in a well-brought-up, little Lord Fauntleroy manner that I hoped might fool her and leave me alone with my secrets, "Good afternoon, Miss Sampson." Her own voice was as unremarkable as an aunt's. "Good afternoon, dear." All the more alarming then, as I sat waiting on one of the cane-bottomed chairs in the corridor, while Ben Steinberg, Miss McIntyre's star pupil, played Max Brooke, to hear the same voice oddly transmuted, resonating above the slight swishing and breathing of her congregation, all those women in gloves, hats, fur pieces, packed in among ghostly pampas grass. It had stepped down a tone, no, several, and came from another continent. I felt a shiver go up my spine. It was the Indian speaking through her out of another existence. Standing at an angle to the half-open door, I caught only a segment of the scene. In the glow of candlelight of bronze, at 3:30 in the afternoon, when the sun outside lay sweltering in the glare of a blue-black thundercloud, a being I could no longer think of as the woman in the lift, with her sensible shoes and her well-cut navy suit, was seated cross-legged among cushions, eyes closed, head rolled back, with all the throat exposed as for a knife stroke. A low humming filled the room. The faint luminescence of the pampas grass was angelic, and I was reminded of something I had seen once from the window of a railway carriage as my train sat steaming on the line. 3 old men, tramps they might have been, in a luminous huddle behind the glass of a waiting shed, their grey heads aureoled with fog, and the closed space aglow with their breathing, like a jar full of fireflies. The vision haunted me. It was entirely real. I mean, the tramps were real enough. You might have smelled them if you got close. But the way I had seen them changed that reality, made me so aware that I could recall details I could not possibly have seen at that distance or with the naked eye. A greenish grey of one old man's hair where it fell in locks over his shoulder, the grime of a hand bringing out all its wrinkles, the ring of dirt round a shirt collar. Looking through into Miss Sampson's room was like that. I saw too much. I felt lightheaded and began to sweat. A flutter of excitement passed over the scene. A new presence had entered the room. It took the form of a child's voice, treble and whining, and one of the women gave a cry that was immediately supported by a buzz of other voices. The treble one, stronger now, cut through them. Miss Sampson was swaying like a flower on its stalk. Minutes later, behind the door of Miss Katie's sunny studio, having shown off my scales, my arpeggios, my three pieces, I stood with my back to the piano, facing the wall beyond which so much emotion was contained, while Miss Katie played intervals, and I named them, or struck chords, and I named those. It wasn't difficult. It was simple mathematics, and I had an ear, though the chords might also, in other contexts and in ways that were not explicable, move you to tears. There is no story, no set of events that leads anywhere or proves anything, no middle, no end, just a glimpse through a half-open door, voices seen, not heard, vibrations sensed through a wall, while the trained ear strains not to hear what is passing in the next room, but to measure the chords, precise, fixed, nameable as diminished fifths or Neapolitan sixths, but also at moments approaching tears that are being struck out on an iron-framed upright, and the voice that names them your own. I just want to end with a poem, short poem. Coming to festivals is often a very unnerving experience. You spend a lot of time meeting lots of people, facing lots of people. And writers are very solitary people who find it sometimes very difficult to make that transition from an interior world where they are a lot of the time and a world where you actually face the world of events and other people. This is a poem I wrote at the Melbourne Writers' Festival after a particularly hard day. And I got back to the hotel room feeling literally like death. And, in these places you often have in the room an apple or some fruit and a bottle of wine. And this is a poem really about that. I mean, some people have read it as a love poem. I think of it as a poem about the angel of death, but I mean, you read it as you want. I'm just going to read it very, very quickly. It's a poem called Afterword. And you can think of those of us who are writers here and what may really be going on in our heads. Afterword. After a whole day pressed by crowds, the close, the loud lives, some of them those of loved ones or ones nearly loved, the joy of finding you here, embodied silence I need not fill, at ease after the roads you've travelled, and with just a trace on your skin, in the scent you give off, of what you bring me, the light you'll pour into my mouth, of fields where on the way you rested. But not tonight, you say, not yet, your smile assures me. We are alone, no need between us for speech. Take your time, eat the last of the apple, finish your wine. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions if people want to ask questions.
You make your way to the microphone in the centre aisle. David, while people are thinking out their questions, I wonder, in the first story you read, the last speaker of the language, seems to me a tremendous piece of work. I just wonder what the Norwegian lexicographer, whose story it is after all, would have to say about translation, about the possibility of translation, because the story seems to say so very strongly that that each language embodies a conception of the world which is hermetically sealed from every other language. And yet it's curious, we're actually not reading the story in Norwegian, we're reading it in English, which is some sort of translation.
Yeah. Translation, of course, is a fascinating thing to a writer, because in some part of his mind, he knows it's impossible. That what happens in one language can't be reproduced in another language, because that language is a product of a whole history, of a whole set of relationships to a particular landscape, a particular light, to a particular sense people have of the way objects impinge on their lives, but also particular syntax. I've translated several poems, say, from Latin, and anybody who's done Latin knows that, for example, you don't have to worry about order in Latin, because the words can come in absolutely any order, because the grammatical relationship of the words establishes the sense. And so there's a way in which a Latin poem, say by Horace, is like a tessellated pavement, where all these brilliant stones are set side by side, and they're placed side by side not because of their logical relationship to one another, but because of the sparks that are struck off one word by another word in proximity. Now, we can't do that in English. We have to find some other way of rendering that, and we can never render the kind of spatial qualities of a Latin poem. So, what gets translated is something, sense can be translated, and a poet can try in his own language to make a translation, say, of a poem, which is a real poem in that language. But that's what can be done. I have a French translator, and I'm very interested. I think he's a brilliant translator. And what he does, I know, with books of mine, is he looks around for French writers who write with a style that is in some way related to the way I write, and he would try to find between a couple of writers who he thinks are appropriate a little space where he can squeeze one of my books in as if it were a lost French book. And that seems to me to be a wonderful notion of how you might be trying to place a translated work into a different language. But translation is a great mystery, really. And, sometimes if you know another language well enough, you can recognize just how much work and how brilliantly a translator has done that. But, most translations we know are done by people who are working for almost nothing and against time. And I don't know how much of the book gets recreated in the other language.
In the previous session, you gave 7 translations of a poem from the Latin. Am I to take that they were all actually quite valid by the end of them? By the end of the translations, they seemed so wildly different from the first, and it almost seemed comic, really, and flippant. Is that right? You can actually, in that instance, translate so wildly differently, or?
Yeah, but I partly, all poetry is quite dense. And so there are levels of, several different meanings are pushed together in a poem. And in some ways, a translation has to tease the meanings out. I've had metaphor is a very interesting thing. I think I had a poem in which it said something like, I can't remember what it was, but it was coffins like something or other. And the translator came to me and said, when you have this metaphor and there are these 2 objects that are being compared to one another, which one do you think of as being primary? Because that will determine how I try to render that in Italian, because I can't render it in Italian so that the 2 things being compared have the same weight, because that won't work. So tell me which one you think as being the one I should put the emphasis on. And that tells you about how dense poetry is and how you have to spell out the different meanings that may be contained in a single little concatenation of words. The other thing is that in poetry particularly, any word you use in a poem has a long history in the poetry of that language. So you can't, in translating the poem, reproduce all the reverberations in the long history and the whole use of that word in poetry in the language. You simply can't reproduce that. So you really have to maybe translate something several times so that you can get all the things that are contained in what's a very dense, in the case of the Hadrian poem, a little 47-syllable poem, which has got several lines of meaning woven into it. Does that make sense?
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the difficulty that a writer encounters coming to an event such as this, given the solitary nature of the writing enterprise. And a number of writers today have had recourse to the same procedure as you, which is to read to us some of their own writings. And I've found that a very rewarding experience, but I wonder what's in it for the reader, for the person reading out his own work. What value do you add for yourself by reading to us rather than relying on us to read your work in the anonymity of our own studies?
Yeah, look, I'm always interested to hear a writer read, because even if the writer's not a very good reader, what you hear is something idiosyncratic about the way he breathes, the way he phrases things, which is actually there on the page. That it determines the pace, and it determines all sorts of things in the writing, especially in poetry. To hear the poet himself read the poem tells you a great deal about how that poem is related to the physical body of the poet. And the longer one goes on doing all of these things, the more convinced you are that say, poetry has as much to do with body as it does with words or with thoughts. And so to actually hear a writer breathing through the prose or the poetry is to hear something, is to get quite close to something that's very idiosyncratic. And well, what the reader gets out of that is a sense that he is actually giving the people who are hearing that a real insight into the way he thinks the prose falls or the poem falls. And, it's always a little bit alarming, for example, to hear an actor reading a poem of yours. I mean, it's read, technically, it's read much, much better than you would read it. But he's also performing it in a way which is not quite true to the way you hear that poem in your own head. And there's a kind of quality of the theatrical about reading that I think all writers want to resist. And there is also, I would want to say, a very, very fine line drawn between appearances like this of your trying to be yourself and not to have too much of a kind of performance self that you can trot out, which allows you to hide and really not appear. And the temptation here always is to offer a performance rather than a presence, if that's not. Sorry, I was going to go back to John's question, because I think you were asking me a slightly different question, weren't you, John, when you asked about that story? You're thinking of that story itself as already a translation. Yes, yeah. Yes. What do you make of that?
David, you've floored me completely. I don't know. I don't know how.
Oh, it's an interesting question, because, that presumably is that Norwegian man speaking to somebody or writing or thinking in his head. And he's thinking it in Norwegian, and the Norwegian doesn't appear until we have those 6 or 7 words at the end. So really the question of what it is we're reading is a very interesting question.
Fred, we've run out of time. Would you join me in thanking David for it?